John Caldwell had never been a man prone to superstition or fear. A pragmatic individual in his late 20s, he had seen enough of life to know that it was tough and that opportunities didn't come knocking every day. So when he was offered a job as the night security guard for a new, sprawling supermarket on the outskirts of town, with a salary far exceeding the norm for such a position, he jumped at the chance without a second thought. The first day was uneventful, filled with the mundane rituals of starting a new job. The supermarket, named Metromart, was a gargantuan structure, its shelves stocked with everything from groceries to electronics. John was shown around by his supervisor, a stern-looking man named Mr. Hargrove. The tour concluded with the security office, a small, windowless room filled with monitors, a desk, and a single chair. From here, John was expected to watch over the entire store, aided by a state-of-the-art surveillance system that covered every inch of the building. "Anything I should be aware of?" John had asked, more out of habit than actual concern. Mr. Hargrove paused for a moment, his eyes flickering with something John couldn't quite place. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said, his tone betraying no emotion. "Just keep an eye on the monitors. If you see anything, make a note of it. We have a logbook for that purpose. And remember, your job is to watch. Don't try to play hero if you see something unusual." John had nodded, not thinking much of the warning. The first night passed quietly, with John settling into his role. The monitors displayed a sea of static shelves and empty aisles. His mind wandered as he flipped through the cameras, boredom quickly setting in. It was around 3 a.m. when he noticed the first oddity. One of the cameras in the far back corner of the store, near the storage area, blinked to life, signaling movement. John's eyes snapped to the screen, but the camera only showed a flickering image of empty space. He leaned closer, squinting at the monitor, but saw nothing unusual. "Probably just a glitch," he muttered to himself, jotting it down in the logbook as instructed. A few hours later, he heard something outside the security office. It was faint, like the scuffling of feet or the rustle of clothes brushing against metal. John stiffened, his hand instinctively moving towards the flashlight on the desk. He waited, ears straining, but the noise didn't repeat. After a few minutes, he convinced himself it was just his imagination, the product of a long night and an overactive mind. The rest of the shift passed without incident, and as the sun began to rise, John logged out, shrugged off the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his gut, and headed home. The second night started much like the first. John arrived at the supermarket just before 11 p.m., greeted by the same stillness and silence that marked the overnight hours. He made his rounds, checking the locks on the doors and ensuring everything was in order before settling into the security office. Again, the first few hours were uneventful, the monotony only broken by the occasional static hum of the security monitors. But just after 2 a.m., the same camera from the night before signaled movement. John felt a chill run down his spine as he switched to the feed, but once again, the image showed nothing but empty space. This time, however, he noticed something else. The camera seemed to be swaying slightly, as if it had been nudged. He was about to get up and check it when he heard a noise outside the office. This time it was louder, more distinct. A soft, deliberate knock on the door. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He stared at the door, expecting to hear a voice or another knock, but nothing came. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. "Who's there?" John called out, his voice wavering slightly. No answer. He waited, muscles tense, but the knock didn't come again. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly rose from his chair, flashlight in hand, and approached the door. He pressed his ear against it, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. Steeling himself, he turned the handle and yanked the door open, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The corridor outside was empty. John's grip tightened on the flashlight as he stepped out of the office, sweeping the beam down the hallway. The air was thick, the darkness almost palpable as if it had substance. His footsteps echoed ominously as he walked the length of the corridor, checking every nook and cranny, but found no sign of anyone or anything. Returning to the office, John closed the door and locked it, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The rest of the night dragged on, with John sitting at the monitors, too tense to relax, eyes darting between the screens and the door. When his shift finally ended, he practically bolted out of the supermarket, the early morning light offering a sense of safety he hadn't realized he'd been craving. On the third night, John arrived at work with a sense of unease that had been growing all day. He couldn't stop thinking about the previous night, the movement on the camera, the knock on the door. He'd almost convinced himself to quit, to walk away from the job and never look back, but something held him back. Maybe it was the money, or maybe it was pride. Either way, he was determined to see this through. Before starting his shift, John decided to call Mr. Hargrove. The phone rang several times before his supervisor finally answered, his voice groggy as if he had just woken up. "What is it, Caldwell?" Mr. Hargrove sounded irritated, but John didn't care. "I've been hearing things," John began, his voice low. "Strange noises outside the office, movement on the cameras, but nothing's there. And last night someone knocked on the door, but when I checked, no one was there." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment John thought the call had disconnected. But then Mr. Hargrove spoke, his tone more serious than John had ever heard. "We've had issues like this before," Mr. Hargrove admitted. "Strange things happen in that store at night. We don't know why, and we've had people quit over it. That's why the pay is so high. We need someone who can handle it. If you want to quit, I understand. Just let me know, and I'll find someone else." John was stunned. He had expected some kind of reassurance, an explanation that would put his mind at ease. Instead, he was being offered a way out, but something in him refused to take it. "No, I'll stay," John said, surprising himself with his resolve. "Good," Mr. Hargrove replied. "Just remember what I said. Your job is to watch, not to investigate. If things get too intense, lock yourself in the office and wait it out." With that, the call ended, leaving John with a heavy sense of foreboding. The night began quietly, as it had before, but the tension in the air was palpable. John's eyes flickered to the door more often than not, every creak and groan of the building setting his nerves on edge. Around 2:30 a.m., the camera in the storage area blinked to life again, signaling movement. This time, John didn't hesitate. Grabbing his flashlight, he left the office, determined to catch whatever, or whoever, was causing the disturbances. He moved cautiously through the supermarket, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The store, which had seemed so ordinary during the day, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows, each aisle a potential hiding spot for something unknown. As he approached the back of the store, the sounds began again, a soft, shuffling noise that seemed to come from just ahead. John quickened his pace, the adrenaline surging through him, fueling his determination. But as he turned a corner into one of the aisles, the sound stopped abruptly. He scanned the area but found nothing. Frustrated, he turned to head back to the office when he heard it, a faint whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. John spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction of the voice, and froze. At the end of the aisle stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. The figure's arms hung at its sides, the hands reaching almost to its knees. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but John could feel its eyes on him, cold and malevolent. "Who are you?" John demanded, his voice trembling. "What are you doing here?" The figure didn't respond, but its presence seemed to fill the space, a suffocating aura of dread that pressed down on John from all sides. Then, slowly, it began to move toward him, its footsteps eerily silent on the linoleum floor.
"You won't be able to leave,"
the figure whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves.
"You'll never leave."
Panic surged through John as he turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. He could hear the figure's footsteps behind him, gaining speed. the sound growing louder and louder until it was almost deafening. John sprinted back to the security office, slamming the door behind him and locking it with shaking hands. He backed away from the door, breathing heavily as the footsteps stopped just outside. For a moment there was silence. Then the door shook violently as the figure began pounding on it with inhuman strength, the sound reverberating through the small room. The door rattled on its hinges, the metal groaning under the force of the blows. John backed into the corner, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his spine as he waited, paralyzed with fear. The pounding continued, growing more frantic, more desperate, as if the figure was determined to break through. But just as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse, the absence of sound leaving John with nothing but his racing thoughts. He waited, counting the minutes until the first light of dawn began to filter through the crack under the door. Only then did he dare to move, slowly unlocking the door and peering out into the corridor. There was no sign of the figure. The supermarket was still and silent, bathed in the soft glow of morning. John didn't wait around. He grabbed his things and left the supermarket, his hands still shaking as he locked the doors behind him for the last time. John never returned to the supermarket after that night. He handed in his resignation via email, citing personal reasons, and refused to answer any of Mr. Hargrove's calls. The nightmares started soon after, vivid and terrifying dreams of the figure in the supermarket, its long arms reaching out for him, its whispering voice promising that he would never escape. John's sleep was fitful, his waking hours haunted by the memory of that night. He moved to a new town, taking a job far away from anything resembling security work, but the fear never left him. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, lingered, a shadow that clung to him no matter where he went. Sometimes, late at night, John would hear a soft knock at his door, and the old fear would return, paralyzing him with the memory of the supermarket. He would lie in bed, heart pounding, waiting for the first light of dawn to chase away the darkness. But deep down, John knew that the darkness would never truly leave him, that the figure in the supermarket was more than just a memory. It was a part of him now, a specter that he could never outrun, and he would never forget the night when he learned that some things were better left unseen, and some doors were better left unopened.